Welcome to Wisła in Poland. We're here at the annual conference of the European Leadership Forum, which is a coalition of evangelical Christian groups seeking to do what no single organization could do alone: provide a bridge between God's global resources and local leaders from all over Europe. I'm joined by Stephen Meyer, Director of the Center for Science and Culture at Discovery Institute and a founder of the modern intelligent design movement. A Cambridge University-trained philosopher of science, he is author of peer-reviewed publications in technical, scientific, philosophical and other books and journals. His books include Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design, and Darwin's Doubt, The Explosive Origin of Animal Life, and The Case for Intelligent Design. He has been interviewed by many leading media outlets, including the New York Times, CNN, Fox News, and the BBC. And now Steve is here to tell us all about intelligent design. Welcome to the studio.
Nice to be with you, Tim.
Steve.
Yeah.
And before we go into intelligent design, could you give a sort of overview of different explanations for the origin of human life?
Well, there are many different positions on the origin of life generally. There is probably the standard view in the academy has long been what's called neo-Darwinian evolution, the modern form of Darwin's theory. But there are also theistic versions of evolution. So there's the idea of theistic evolution, that God is using the mechanisms of Darwinian evolution to produce life. And then there are various creationist views, people who think that life was created by God separately, different forms of life, either a long time ago, these would be called old earth creationists, or a very short time ago, and this would be the young earth creationists. And then there's a new view that is not necessarily antithetical to all the others, but it has a different way of framing the issue, and that's called the theory of intelligent design. And that's the view I represent. So.
And when did that view, that school of thought come into being?
Well, the modern intelligent design research community started to form in the 1980s and 90s and has really picked up speed in the last 10 years. The idea that there's evidence of design in nature that can be detected scientifically or by observing or analyzing nature is a very ancient idea. It goes back to the Greeks, the Roman philosopher Cicero argued for design, the medieval philosophers argued for it, and many of the founders of the modern scientific revolution, Newton, Kepler, Boyle, all made design arguments based on the evidences of nature. And so the intellectual pedigree of the design movement, if you will, goes way back, and it's an ancient idea that's being revived by modern scientific discoveries.
And there's a term, a sort of buzzword that's emerged called irreducible complexity. Have I reached the sort of core of the argument here?
Well, there are several different modern arguments for intelligent design based on scientific evidences, and the argument from irreducible complexity is one of those arguments. And it's, I think, a very good argument, and it's been much maligned on the internet, and there have been many premature reports of Michael Behe's demise, and so I'm happy to speak to that argument and its status. I think an even more fundamental argument is the argument from biological or genetic information, because to build those molecular machines, those complex, irreducibly complex structures that Behe talks about, there is a prior need for information to build the protein parts out of which the bacterial flagellar motor and other irreducibly complex structures are made. So that's maybe giving an indication of the multifaceted nature of the case for design. There's also evidence in physics and in cosmology for design, in the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics or the initial conditions of the universe. There's a wonderful design argument about the fine-tuning of conditions necessary to make planet Earth possible and fit for both habitability and also a fit platform for scientific discovery. It's called the privileged planet hypothesis. So the design research community of scholars and scientists around the world is developing a lot of arguments for design based on a lot of scientific discoveries that are suggestive of a role of intelligence in the development of the universe and life both.
And the other terms that are sort of analysed are, which you address in your presentations, is chance and necessity, and from which is the better explanation, or which combination is the better.
Right. There's a famous book written by one of the leading molecular biologists of the 1960s during the period of time, which a fascinating period of scientific history called the Molecular Biological Revolution. It started with Fred Sanger and then Watson and Crick at Cambridge, but continued for about 15 years of just explosive period of discovery. And one of those scientists was Jacques Monod, a colleague of Crick's later in the 60s, a French molecular biologist, and he wrote a famous book called Chance and Necessity. And he said, if you're going to be a scientist and you want to explain something, you want to explain it by either these random or stochastic processes, which can be summarized as chance events, or you want to explain it by natural law-like processes, which he called necessity. If I drop a ball and it falls to the earth, we say it falls by necessity according to the law of gravity. And in my talk on the origin of life, I examine the different attempts that have been made to explain the origin of the information that would be necessary to produce the first life, and I show that most of those attempts were relying on either chance or necessity or the combination of the two. The upshot of my argument is that all of those have failed, and that if we want to be good scientists, we need to open our minds to another explanatory category, and that's the idea of design or intelligent design, because we know that there are some things in the world, in the universe, in life, that in our experience that are only produced by intelligent agents. And when we encounter things that we know that are only produced by intelligent agents, the most rational thing to do is infer that an intelligent agent produced those things, not to rely on chance and necessity. Those are good explanatory tools. They explain some kinds of things, but they don't explain everything.
And before we go into detail again, can we just step back and look at the environment and the culture that we're in, where there are many popular theories, and in one sense Darwin got his traction by disseminating his Origin of Species book and the like.
Right.
It's quite difficult in the present context to come through with any new theory and somehow penetrate the culture.
Well, one of the things that makes intelligent design get immediate traction is that it is, in a sense, the alternative, the natural alternative to the main thrust of the Darwinian argument. Charles Darwin, his brilliant book, beautifully argued, and one of the things that he was trying to show was that the appearance of design that all biologists recognized at the time and that biologists today recognize was the product of an undirected, unguided mechanism, which he called natural selection. And he analogized natural selection to the powers that human breeders were known to have in changing the attributes of a population. I always like to use the example of sheep in the far north of Scotland. And breeders or ranchers of sheep herders would, if they wanted to breed a woollier breed of sheep, they would select the woolliest males and the woolliest females out of the population and allow only them to breed. The next generation would be a tiny bit woollier, and then they'd make the same selection process again, pulling the very woolliest out, allowing only them to breed, repeating through several cycles, and eventually they'd get a woollier breed of sheep. Darwin came along. He didn't use the sheep as an example, that's my example, but with other organisms, and he said, well, couldn't we have a series of natural changes in environment that would produce the same outcome? So for example, using my example, couldn't we have a series of very cold winters that would kill off all but the woolliest males and females so that only they would breed, and so that in the end the outcome would be the same, a woollier breed of sheep. And that was his brilliant insight, that nature could do what the human breeder could do. Therefore, nature could select what we heretofore thought only intelligence could do. And so his mechanism of natural selection was thought to be, was presented as a kind of designer substitute that could explain the principal evidence of design that had captured the imagination of 19th century biologists, which was the adaptation of organisms to their environment. A woolly sheep in a cold climate, well adapted. Well, Darwin says, I can explain that too by looking at what nature does. So he replaced artificial selection with natural selection and got rid of design.
And you've written a book, Darwin's Doubt, so that's a very interesting title, considering that it seems as though he sorted the whole argument out, and you've written this book on his doubt.
Well, many modern, I call them Darwin's public defenders, people like Richard Dawkins, or in our country, Eugenie Scott, are prone to rhetorical excess. And Professor Dawkins has been quoted as saying that if you doubt the theory of evolution, you're either stupid, wicked, or insane. And then he says he prefers not to think about the wicked bit. But and in our country, Eugenie Scott had a very prominent hearing about what to teach about the theory of evolution, where a school board was considering the idea that we ought to teach the strengths and weaknesses of scientific theories. The students said there are no scientific weaknesses with evolutionary theory, and thus the theory ought to be exempted from that kind of a standard. Well, in contrast to that kind of rhetorical dogmatism, Darwin himself was actually very modest rhetorically. And he was aware that the argument that he was presenting, though it had many strengths, it also had some difficulties. And one of them was the problem of the sudden appearance of the major groups of animal forms, the very first animals in the history of life, in a period that we now call the Cambrian, and the explosive origin of animal life is now called the Cambrian explosion. And Darwin was very aware of this event in the history of life, and the sudden appearance of these fossil remains of these animals in the Cambrian strata. And he said that this was a very legitimate objection to the views here entertained. And he described the problem, and he said as to why these animals appear suddenly in the fossil record, he said he could give no adequate explanation. And so that was his doubt. And what I do in the book is I tell the story of that doubt and how it has developed and grown into actually a full-blown crisis in evolutionary biology, to the point that we have leading evolutionary theorists now calling for a new theory of evolution, because they recognize that Darwin's mechanism of natural selection acting on random mutation or variations, and we would now refer to random mutations, does not have the creative power that Darwin attributed to it, and that evolutionary biologists since Darwin have typically believed that it has.
And this term neo-Darwinism,
right.
Can you sort of expand on that?
Sure. It's the neo-Darwinism is the modern version of Darwin's theory, and it incorporates insights from genetics that Darwin was unaware of in the 1850s and 60s. And in particular, it incorporates the idea that mutations are a form of random variation that are driving the evolutionary process, that are producing new form and structure in the history of life. So the Darwinian mechanism was natural selection acting on random genetic variations. Now biologists would talk about natural selection acting on random variations, but also a particular form of variation called mutation, which we understand in terms of changes to the sequences of the genetic, the chemicals that form the genetic text.
And proponents of ID, before we go into
Sure.
What they see about the origin of human life, on that specific instance of the Cambrian explosion, how do you read that?
Well, maybe we could back up just a bit
Sure.
to define ID,
Sure.
because Darwin's theory is actually very helpful in, you asked a minute ago about the traction that ID
Yes.
is getting, and that it is very hard for a new theory to get traction, but intelligent design, I think, is getting traction for a couple of reasons. One, because we think there's very strong evidence for it, and we can talk about that in a minute, but secondly, because we are framing the argument around the central proposition of Darwinian theory. We're engaging the very question that he designed his theory to engage. All biologists recognize that living organisms give the appearance of design. Richard Dawkins, with whom I disagree, but whom I appreciate for the clarity he brings to the debate, has said that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. And there he's speaking as a good Darwinian. He's a good neo-Darwinian, but he is expressing the Darwinian view that started with Darwin himself, that the appearance of design is effectively an illusion because there is an undirected, unguided process that can produce that appearance without any guidance or direction behind it. And that process is natural selection acting on random variations and mutations.
That's the central argument, isn't it?
That's the central argument. It's the central proposition of Darwinism, I think, is its central legacy, is its refutation of design in biology, because natural selection, again, can do what the human breeder can do, or any intelligence can do, and therefore we don't need an intelligent designer or creator to explain the appearance of design in life. And intelligent design is taking on that proposition. It's saying that the appearance of design is not an illusion, it's in many cases real, and it's the product of an actual designing intelligence. And so the design that we see is the result of real design, not apparent design.
And so at the sort of street fighting level, you know, how do they portray you and the ID community?
Right, in the media,
okay,
and at the street level, there is an attempt oftentimes to caricature our position and to confuse us or to conflate intelligent design with, for example, young Earth creationism, which many of the, in the academic circles, that's a way of trying to impute disreputability to intelligent design. Now, intelligent design, there are advocates of intelligent design who are young Earth creationists, but young Earth creationism and intelligent design are two different things. Intelligent design is not based on scriptural revelation. It is not a deduction or an interpretation of a scriptural text. It's an inference from biological evidence or from cosmological or physical evidence. So that's one difference. The starting point is completely different. The basis of intelligent design is scientific evidence, not scripture. And secondly, intelligent design is an age-neutral theory. It's not making claims about the age of the Earth. Young Earth creationism is clearly making the claim that the Earth is very young, but intelligent design is taking on this central Darwinian proposition that says that the appearance of design is an illusion. We're saying no, it's real, and you can tell by looking at certain evidences. So we're really engaging a completely different question than creationism.
We're on the subject of populism. Who knows where these recordings will go? But you use terms like abductive and retrodictive. Could you just expand on those?
Well, in the PhD work I did at Cambridge in the 1980s, I was investigating the question of whether or not, I was investigating first and foremost the question of how scientists reason about events in the remote past. When you're looking at evolutionary history and trying to understand the origin of the first life or the origin of animal life, that's a different kind of science than when you go into the lab and repeat an experiment under controlled conditions that can be replicated by someone else. And so in my PhD work, I gave a characterization of the historical scientific method to show how it was being used by evolutionary biologists or by cosmologists or archaeologists or forensic scientists. And it turns out that whereas in many branches of science, scientists rely on inductive reasoning, or a method of reasoning that's called the hypothetico-deductive method, in biology or in historical sciences, scientists reason from effects back to causes. We have the clues that are left behind, and we try to figure out what caused those clues. And that's a form of inference that's called abduction, or it's also retrodictive in the sense that it's going backwards in time. So it's a different scientific method. And interestingly, it's the method that Darwin used in The Origin of Species. And I use the same method of reasoning in developing my case for intelligent design in Signature in the Cell and in Darwin's Doubt. And so it's kind of an irony in that I'm using Darwin's method of reasoning to come to a non-Darwinian conclusion about design. But I have great respect for him as someone who wrote obviously a great scientific book, and I especially appreciate his pioneering use of this historical scientific method, which I use, even though I part company with him on the design question.
I've got young children. The appeal to them, and I suppose to school communities, is the simplicity of saying this is the evidence. And so if I was asking on behalf of my 12-year-old son, I would say, what is the evidence for ID?
Absolutely, that's very good, because I think the evidence is very compelling and can be comprehended by people at various levels. It admits various levels of scientific analysis, but to me the stop-press moment in the history of biology was not only the discovery of the structure of the DNA molecule in 1953 by Watson and Crick, but what ensued from that in this period of the molecular biological revolution. 1957, Francis Crick proposes something called the sequence hypothesis. And what he argues is, or what he suggests, is the DNA molecule has chemical subunits along the interior of the spine of the DNA molecule that are functioning just like alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters in a machine code. They're literally storing information in a digital or alphabetic form for constructing the proteins and protein machines that cells need to stay alive. So when we think about what's running the show in biology, we're actually talking about information, genetic text, and that, or some scientists refer to it as digital code. Our local hero in the Seattle area, Bill Gates, says that DNA is like a software program, only much more complex than any that has ever been created. Richard Dawkins himself acknowledges that DNA is uncannily machine-like. The information in DNA is uncannily machine-like. It's like computer code. Now, most younger people are more intuitively connected to the information technology that we use in computers. And I used to ask my students, if you want to give your computer a new function, what do you have to give it? And students would get it right away. You need code or a program or digital code. And the same thing is true in life. If you want to build a new animal from a pre-existing animal, you have to have new information. If you want to build life in the first place from simpler non-living chemicals, you've got to have the chemicals arrange themselves into informational sequences that are capable of building the proteins and machines that we need to keep cells alive. So one of the primary evidences of design is the digital information that's stored in the DNA molecule. It has the same attributes as a written language or a digital code.
And applying the same method, are there other, more credible explanations for its existence?
Well, there are alternative explanations, and in the book Signature in the Cell, because I use the inference to the best explanation method that Darwin pioneered, I go through those competing explanations, and I explain them, describe them, and then also critique them. And the big story in origin of life research is that over the last 20 to 30 years, there has been a deepening impasse in the field, because whether the theories are invoking chance or law-like necessity or some combination of the two, they have all failed to explain the origin of the information that's necessary to build or generate the first living cell. And so that's the unsolved problem from the standpoint of materialistic evolutionary theory. But that's also where I think intelligent design comes in, because what we know from experience is that intelligent agents are capable of generating information. They have what philosophers call the known causal power to produce the effect in question. And this is also part of the Darwinian method. When you're trying to make an inference to the best explanation about what caused something in the remote past, you need to invoke causes that are known to produce the effect in question. And he got this principle from his mentor, Charles Lyell, the great geologist, pioneering geologist, who said that we should be looking for causes now in operation. And when I came across that phrase in Lyell's work, I said, it was a moment when the nickel dropped. You had an aha moment, and I said to myself, I asked myself the question, what is the cause now in operation that produces digital information, digital code? And I realized there was only one such cause that was known. It was intelligence. I knew of the impasse in origin of life studies. I knew that causes based on chance or invoking chance, necessity, or the combination were unable to produce information. But there is a cause of which we know that does produce information, and that's mind or intelligence. One information scientist said that information is habitually associated with conscious activity. And so when we find information at the foundation of life, the most natural thing to infer, based on our knowledge of cause and effect, is that conscious activity, intelligence, produce that information.
Coming back to our culture and how these arguments can be presented and received, how are you getting on in terms of the scientific community, in terms of the proportion of people who would acknowledge this?
Well, it's a little hard to assess exact percentages of the scientific community, but I would say that there's very rapid growth in the intelligent design research community, the community of scientists who are attracted to the idea of intelligent design, who are using it in their research, who are persuaded by one or more of the arguments for intelligent design. We've been at this wonderful conference at the European Leadership Forum, and are meeting scientists from across Europe with outstanding credentials, some members of national academies in their own countries, and we're finding tremendous sympathy for the work that we're doing. There have been a couple of scientists who have put themselves forward to serve as members of the editorial board of one of the prominent research journals that the intelligent design community is producing, the journal Biocomplexity. And so the breadth and depth and level of interest in the scientific research program surrounding these questions is really growing at a very rapid rate, and I think that's a very encouraging sign for the work we're doing in the future. Yeah.
Great, and you've just in this short time, you've explained that there's a logical sequence that holds water, as it were. Taking a step forward in terms of how you can affect the worldviews, the philosophical sort of culture of our time. And this is our last question, I think.
Very good.
Yeah.
Well, intelligent design is, as I've said, based on scientific evidence. But very few of us are shy about also admitting that the theory has larger worldview and metaphysical implications. And the way the media likes to portray this, oftentimes in the States, at least the hostile media, is to say, well, if you think it, I'm often in interviews and hostile interviews asked the question aggressive, who do you think the designer is? I personally think the designer is God. And I was on I did a 2-hour interview with the American program Nightline, and they told me that they were interested in the science that we were doing, but the only thing that I said that got into the actual broadcast was, we think it's God. Well, that illustrates something, which is that there's a difference between the evidence for intelligent design, the basis for intelligent design, and its possible implications. I think it has theistic implications, or implications that are friendly to a theistic worldview. It certainly challenges the materialistic worldview, which denies that there is any mind prior to the origin of life or prior to the universe, and instead says that purely material and directed processes produced everything important in the history of the universe and life. We think that you need a mind to explain the origin of life. That then raises the question, who is that designing mind most likely to be? I think through a personal process of philosophical deliberation, I think the mind most likely to be responsible for that is the mind of God. I'm not very favorably disposed to the alien hypothesis that some people have suggested is at least a logical possibility, in part because I already have a lot of reasons for being a committed Christian, but also because from a scientific standpoint, we not only see evidence of design at the point of the origin of the first life, but we also see it in the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics from the very beginning of the universe, and clearly no entity within the universe could be responsible for the design parameters of the universe as a whole. So I think there's a lot of good reasons to believe in design, theistic design, not just design simpliciter.
Stephen, thank you very much.
Thank you for the
interview.
interview.
Great pleasure. Yeah. And also thank you to you, our audience, and to remind you that you can see some of the answers to these questions on the focalonline.org website, foclonline.org. Goodbye.